During the 1850s, something unusual began appearing in city archives across Europe. Construction reports that made no sense. Excavation projects that removed earth by the ton, yet were never explained as drainage work or foundation repair. Instead, buried beneath streets that had supposedly existed for centuries, workers kept finding chambers, corridors, and stonework that predated every official record. Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, London. Different governments, different languages, yet the same pattern. Massive excavations happening simultaneously, all justified with the vaguest possible language. Street improvements, urban modernization, infrastructure upgrades. But when you examine the engineering logs, the real activity becomes clear. They weren't building, they were digging down, uncovering architecture that shouldn't have been there. What caught my attention wasn't a single discovery. It was the timing. Between 1840 and 1880, nearly every major European capital launched large-scale underground projects. Not sewers, those came later. Not subways, those didn't exist yet. These were recovery operations, clearing out layers of compacted earth that had buried entire lower floors of buildings still in active use. And nobody bothered explaining where all that earth came from. The photographic record tells a story officials never wanted written. Early daguerreotypes show workers standing in trenches beside stonework that looks older and more precise than anything built above it. Massive blocks fitted together without mortar, arches buried 10 feet below street level, foundations extending deeper than any blueprint indicated. In some images you can see doorways half swallowed by soil, windows turned into cellar openings, entire facades cut off by a sudden rise in ground level that appeared within living memory. Yet when you search for explanations, the archives go silent. Reports describe removing sediment, but never explain how it got there. Engineers mention unexpected structural depth, but avoid speculating why. City councils authorize the work, fund the crews, move millions of cubic meters of fill, then close the files without ever addressing the obvious question. What were they digging out of? In Vienna, workers uncovered vaulted chambers beneath the Ringstrasse that extended far beyond the footprint of any known building. The official response? Seal them and keep building. In St. Petersburg, excavation teams reported finding corridors that connected structures across entire city blocks, all buried under dense, packed earth. The documentation stops there. No follow-up, no investigation, just a note that the work continued and the chambers were filled back in. London's story might be the strangest. During the 1860s, construction crews working near Westminster kept breaking through into spaces that weren't on any map. Stone rooms with perfect acoustics, corridors aligned to cardinal directions, foundations that suggested the buildings above them were afterthoughts, added later to something much older. Engineers wrote about it in private correspondence, confused by what they were finding. But publicly, nothing. The sites were cleared, the earth was moved, and the discoveries vanished into footnotes. This wasn't archaeology. Archaeologists document, preserve, and study. These operations had a different goal entirely. Remove the evidence, stabilize what remains, and move forward without asking uncomfortable questions. Because if you start asking why entire city districts were buried under meters of compacted sediment, you have to confront something far more disturbing. These cities didn't slowly accumulate debris over centuries. Something covered them quickly, uniformly, and recently enough that the buildings underneath were still structurally sound. The deeper I went into these records, the more one detail kept surfacing. The architecture being uncovered looked older than the cities claiming it. Stone-cutting techniques that didn't match the supposed construction dates. Geometric precision that required tools historians insist didn't exist. And, most troubling, a consistency across locations that suggested a shared building tradition, one that spanned continents yet appears nowhere in our accepted timeline. So why were these excavations kept quiet? Why did every major capital experience the same phenomenon within the same 40-year window? And what exactly were they recovering from beneath streets that should never have been buried in the first place? Because once you see the pattern, you can't ignore it. These weren't random projects, they were coordinated responses to something much larger. And the evidence they tried to bury is still there, hidden in basement archives, forgotten engineering reports, and photographs nobody thought to destroy. What we're looking at isn't urban improvement, it's the systematic unearthing of a previous world. The silence around these operations tells you everything. When cities document their modernization, they're proud. They commission paintings, publish reports, celebrate the transformation. But with these excavations, the records are sparse, technical, almost deliberately boring, as if someone wanted the work done but didn't want anyone thinking too hard about why. Take Chicago. Between 1855 and 1865, the entire downtown was raised between 4 and 14 feet. Official story? Drainage problems. The city sat too close to Lake Michigan. Sewage was an issue. Streets needed elevation. Reasonable enough until you look at the actual work. They didn't just add fill on top. They dug down first, exposing foundations nobody knew existed, then built the new street level around structures that were already there. Photographs from the period show buildings jacked up on screws while workers excavate beneath them. But what's visible in those images isn't new construction. It's old stonework being uncovered, cleaned, and incorporated into the rising street grid. The same pattern emerges in San Francisco. After the 1906 earthquake, rebuilding crews kept hitting unexpected basements, sometimes 2 or 3 levels deep. Rooms with finished walls, intact floors, architectural details that didn't match anything built in California during the Gold Rush era. The official explanation? Previous construction from earlier settlements. But San Francisco in the 1850s was tents and wooden shacks. Nobody was building multi-level stone basements with decorative archways. Yet there they were, buried and forgotten until disaster forced them back into view. What makes this undeniable is the architectural consistency. From Lisbon to Melbourne, the buried structures share characteristics that shouldn't exist across such distances. Similar window proportions, nearly identical arch designs, stonework that looks machined rather than carved. It's not that every city had the same builders. It's that they were all uncovering remnants of the same building tradition, one that existed before the mud came. And that's the part historians refuse to address directly. Because if you acknowledge that a coordinated mud event buried advanced architecture across multiple continents, you're admitting our timeline is wrong. You're suggesting there was a previous civilization, one sophisticated enough to build in stone at a scale we associate with much later periods. One that got buried so thoroughly it took decades of industrial-era excavation to dig it back out. The photographic evidence makes this impossible to dismiss. Early images from the 1850s through 1880s consistently show the same thing. Workers standing in excavated pits beside walls that extend far below modern street level. Doorways that open into darkness. Windows positioned where no windows should be if the buildings were constructed at current ground height. These aren't ambiguous images, they're clear documentation of a world that existed at a different elevation, one that got covered and had to be systematically recovered. So why isn't this taught? Why do textbooks skip over the largest coordinated construction effort of the 19th century? Because explaining it requires explaining what came before, and what came before doesn't fit the narrative we've been given about human development, technological progress, or the age of our current civilization. The excavations weren't just practical responses to urban flooding. They were archaeological recoveries disguised as civil engineering. Cities weren't raising streets, they were uncovering foundations. They weren't improving infrastructure, they were inheriting it. Every sealed chamber in Vienna, every filled corridor in St. Petersburg, every basement in Chicago that extends deeper than it should, they're all pieces of the same puzzle. Evidence of a world that was buried deliberately or catastrophically, then partially recovered by people who didn't fully understand what they were finding. And the most unsettling part, the recovery stopped. By 1890, most of these operations wound down, not because the work was finished, but because someone decided it was finished. The deeper levels stayed buried, the oldest foundations remained sealed, and the questions that should have been asked never made it past private correspondence between confused engineers. Which means beneath every major city that underwent these operations, there's still more. Deeper layers, older structures, evidence we chose to leave underground rather than confront what it reveals about our past. The maps still exist. The engineering reports are still filed away in municipal archives. The photographs still show workers standing beside stonework that predates our accepted chronology. Everything is there, catalogued and ignored, waiting for someone to ask the questions that matter. Because this isn't about conspiracy. It's about a choice made over a century ago to move forward rather than look back. To rebuild rather than investigate. To cover what was uncovered and pretend the anomalies never existed. But the evidence doesn't disappear just because we stop looking at it. Those sealed chambers are still under Vienna. Those buried corridors still run beneath St. Petersburg. Chicago's oldest foundations still extend down into darkness below the raised streets. Every city that participated in these operations left behind a record of what they found, even if they buried the findings themselves. And that's what makes this undeniable. We're not speculating about lost civilizations based on myth or legend. We're looking at documented excavations, official city records, and photographs that show exactly what was beneath our streets before someone decided it should stay there. The question isn't whether this happened. The evidence proves it did. The question is, what else is down there, still waiting, still buried beneath cities that chose to stop digging the moment they realized what they were uncovering?